And hi everyone, welcome to eLearnChat, where you always learn something new. I'm Riggs Zanotti, President, Relay Corporation, and I am joined today by my good friend and co-host, Leslie Price. She's coming to us from just outside London with horses in her backyard. It's kind of cool. And she works with learnappeal.org.uk. Leslie, you must be enjoying those horses in the backyard. I know your grandson probably is. It sounds great.
Yeah. Oh, it's just wonderful to have. I mean, I've got cats. My daughter's got cats. She's got a dog. But for the wee man, for, the little
grandson,
chief, to actually be up close to horses
That's
and
cool.
just see them in a natural environment is incredible.
That's wonderful. And in studio, we've got Harold Muliati. He's our video producer. Today, we've got, it's going to be an interesting show because, let's see, we've had the moccasin approach. We've had the rope approach. And today, we're going to be talking about the EI, or emotional intelligence, or emotional quotient tree. So we've got moccasins, a rope, tree. I think we're going to have a game of hangman today. What do you think? Anyway, we've got MacDonald back on. He is always a welcome guest and a source of great information. Here we go. This show is sponsored by Relay Corporation. Digital learning development, media development, corporate video, management consulting, and more. Visit us at www.relate.com. Thanks. And we are back, and in that center position of power, we've got MacDonald in again. Mac, so good to have you back on, and pardon my hangman comment, but I was going, this is great. We've got moccasins, ropes. This is interesting. I can't wait to hear about the emotional intelligence tree, because I think that's probably one of the foundations of what you're doing right now. And tell us a little bit about the EI tree.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. And thanks for having me on yet again. It's been great. I thoroughly enjoy these and always forget that I'm actually on a program, so to speak, and I just get involved in the chat. But I think that's the beauty of it. You guys host it so well.
Thank you.
The EI tree is a concept of really, if you're looking at the end of the programs that we do with organizations, and there it is, it's really the sort of endpoint we're aiming for, because as you look at this particular image, it sort of gives you an idea that if for a tree, for example, normally doesn't have different colored fruit, certainly not different shapes, etc. But on this one, what we're saying is that just like us as people in an organization, we're all different colors, shapes, sizes, etc., religions, cultures, you mention it. And all those words you can see around the place there talking about, well, what should people be? Considerate being one of the main ones, emotionally intelligent, includes all that, caring. And I think this really arrived in my sort of brain at one point because, especially around the COVID pandemic, we started realizing that people were really talking a lot about being more empathetic, caring more for each other, trying to reach out to people in remote teams, virtual working teams, and saying we need to get a better connection going. And with the EI tree, when I was investigating the basis of an article, I discovered that I'd forgotten all about my sort of trees and education in school, because I always presumed that everything came from the roots. But in actual fact, if you think about osmosis and photosynthesis and these things, then from the canopy of the tree, from the upper leaves, with the interaction of the sun and so on, all these different nutrients start traveling both from the roots and from above. So on the image, you might notice there are some arrows going up and down from the roots to the top and back again. So really, this is like your perfect endpoint. And oddly enough, I was talking to a new client today on a new program they're starting next year for 10 months. And when I sent him this, he said, yeah, that actually encapsulates exactly what we want. And again, if you think about the concept of the tree feeding itself with all those different nutrients traveling around from top to bottom and roots to top, then that's how, in our belief, an organization should be communicating and working together. And we sometimes describe it as a team of teams, because so often in organizations you can get very high performing teams, but do they necessarily communicate and work seamlessly with another team? Not always. And sometimes, in fact, there are some pretty big barriers between those teams. And it's those weird, darker areas of our humanity that we sort of start thinking information's power. And then you even get into what we call the saboteur syndrome, where people think, you know what, I'm going to keep this back because I don't want her or him to get the information. I'll keep it to myself. But in actual fact, what they're doing is they're tripping up their colleagues in the other teams, and in fact, the whole organization. That's the problem. But that gives you a pretty decent idea of what the tree's
what you're saying,
trying
Matt,
to generate.
because I actually I mentioned it. Yeah, my daughter was round visiting me today, so that my grandson could see the horses. And she asked me what we were talking about tonight on eLearnChat. And I said to her, the emotional intelligence tree. And she kind of stopped. And, my daughter's a teacher, primary school teacher. And she stopped and raised her eyebrows and said, that is a really good point, because even when you're working with children, with young people, it is all about the tree. So it's not just what they get from the roots. It's not just what comes up from the bottom. It's what they also experience from friends, family, the school, everything else that's going on around them that contributes to their emotional intelligence. And if you don't get the emotional intelligence right in children, you actually end up with maybe some confused adults.
Yeah, well, Daniel Goleman is a name you probably know. That Daniel was attributed pretty much of bringing EI into the public domain, I think would be a fair statement. And I remember watching an interview with him once, and he really was adamant, saying, guys, we need to get this into schools. We need to get it into our children early, so that it's not something you try and teach someone. Because my talk, when I talk to people about EI, I usually say to them, look, EI is very simple to understand, but it's really challenging to implement, because it's asking us to be extremely authentic, to almost say, here's our vulnerabilities, here's what I really fear, what makes me anxious and causes me anxiety, whatever. And with children, when you get them at that young age, it isn't so much having to teach them about it, it's just to say, this is it. This is how we should work with each other. And generally you'll find parents and teachers are saying things like, share and be nice and say thank you. Trying to get that sort of emotional intelligence naturally. And what a great idea. I wish Goleman got more success on his programs, because to get it into schools early is fantastic. I'd love to see that in the UK.
And it's also interesting because you talked about empathy. And we wrote a customer service program for a very large county. Actually, it was Los Angeles County. And it was called SMILE. Service means involvement, listening, and empathy. And at first they all went, empathy? I go, yeah, you have to have empathy. If you don't feel for the person you're servicing, you'll never be able to service them correctly. It's the same with any kind of communication. If you don't, what is it, like you said with the moxie, if you don't put yourself in the other person's shoes for a moment, you're never really going to understand anything of what they feel, what they think, how they react to things. You've got the saboteurs who are a little tweaked usually, and they don't care what you feel or think. They're too busy about thinking about themselves. That's it's kind of like a retarded emotional intelligence, but there's an awful lot of that. And when you were talking about empathy, there's a lot of talk right now that autism, especially things like Asperger's, where it's very mild autism, but it's still a form of autism. And now, mind you, almost every engineer, programmer, whatever, can probably have a little bit of autism, and in terms of Asperger's, but they're very high functioning. Empathy is not high on their scale usually, or it's a more hysterical empathy. The emotions tend to be one extreme or the other. It's hard to get them in a balance mode. How do you deal with that saboteur or the person whose EI is, let's just say, hindered?
Well, it's an interesting point, because I'm diagnosed autistic, but as you said, I'm on the high functioning part. Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, when I speak to people, they don't realise. They normally become aware when I'm particularly honest, because some of the filters aren't quite there. Mm-hmm. So if someone says to me, what's wrong with our organisation? Why is this not working? Why are the teams not getting on? I'll just go and say, here it is. Yep. But link back to your question, when you mentioned about empathy, Goleman again did an interview. He talked with Paul Eckman, who is an expert on empathy. And he decided to say, look, there's actually 3 types of empathy. And what we've got is the first part, he calls it cognitive empathy. But the first part is really, imagine, for example, if I come into work and I speak to someone and I notice they're definitely upset about something, I'll go and chat. I'll say, you know, what's going on? Let me help. And they might say, well, here's what's going on. And the first level of that cognitive side is I understand it. So when the person tells me about it, I think, yeah, I've got that. But if I then get up and walk away, that person will be thinking, well, I'm glad Mac understands it, but that doesn't really help me. Mm-hmm. So he says you've got to have the second part. And the second part is you've understood it, but you actually feel their pain. You literally have that sort of emotional connection to it. And they would then think, well, that's great. He understands it and he's sort of in tune. He really understands the pain I'm going through and he feels it. But he's still gone away and hasn't really helped me. So it's the third part that is the icing on the cake. And we often say it's about a 3-legged stool. You have to have all 3 parts to make it sit comfortably. If just one leg's missing, it's a problem. And the third part is where you understand, you feel for them, and you literally sort of feel their pain, I often describe it as. But the third most important is that you want to help them. You want to do something about it. Yeah. That's where the magic happens. And when you listen to Goleman's interview, he'll say, actually, if you've only got the first one, you've got to think about it. A psychopath has got the first only because they understand your pain, but they don't care. They have no emotional connection to you. They don't want to help you because they have their own agenda. Mm-hmm. And on a much lesser scale, clearly, the saboteur in work understands, but they're so driven by their belief they've been wrong done by, whether it be their manager, a colleague, another team member, that they just drive forward with that belief they have to get justice for themselves by tripping something up. So yeah, it's going back to your point, especially about people who are sort of very much in the high level of technical sides. You know, you talk to most organizations and they will be slightly, I wouldn't say rude or dismissive, but they'll be saying, well, hold on, sort of a lot of the IT guys we've got who work in these specialist areas, they're not quite the same on people skills. But what I've certainly found is, whilst you could maybe say they don't maybe connect in that same way, they're still very good because of their analytical skills and their technical ability. Mm-hmm. They can still connect and fix things. So when, for example, Leslie phones me up and says, here's my issue, because of their sort of brain thinking and how quick they can think about things, they still meet that side of it. Mm-hmm. And when I teach people about the empathy side of it, also called social awareness, I say to people, you know, if you haven't naturally got that ability to be empathetic to people, you need to understand that really if you add it up, you still have to have it. So you need to work on developing your skills. You might not fully appreciate, you know, if you're particularly autistic in a certain way or without those abilities, you might say, you might not be able to connect as well as somebody else, but you can still teach yourself what it is. It's like a numbers game. So I know that if someone says to me, ask me a question about X, there's sometimes a thing that goes in my head and says, I know what I want to say, but actually past experience told me I should be very careful how I say that.
Right.
So it's learning how to get around it.
How on earth do you teach empathy? My goodness. That must be incredibly challenging. To be honest, I've never actually thought about it.
Well, you know, that's a good point. And also, we didn't announce this at the beginning, but we are live on LinkedIn. If anybody's watching and you're in the chat room, please chime in with your experiences and your comments because, you know, we're sharing right now. We feel empathy for your pain too, but seriously. Tell us what you think. And Max here, he's an expert at this. He's very good at what he does. And he may be able to answer some of the questions you have in your particular organization or with people you might work with or anything else. So please get involved. And going back to Leslie's question, how do you teach empathy? Especially when you're starting young, I guess it's easier because you have more of an empty slate or a blank slate. But how do you teach empathy to people who aren't naturally empathetic?
I think certainly the way we do it and the way we put it across is we give scenarios, and they're general scenarios that somebody might understand. You know, somebody comes into work and they are particularly upset about something, and they're sat at a desk and they're clearly upset. They're using tissues to dry their eyes and so on. All these signals are coming out. but this person isn't going to chat to them. What do you think is going on for the person who's upset and the person who's not really engaging and recognizing those signs and signals? So we'll get a discussion going in the classroom. And I think for me personally, the best way to get that going is through discussion. And say, for example, somebody in that room during the learning session will say something like that. I just don't get it. I don't get sometimes why people get so upset about things. It's ridiculous. You're there to do the job. And what you'll generally find is the other people who are far more empathetic and in tune with these types of feelings is they'll say, well, here's why. And I'll say, right, that's very interesting. So, and now I'll go to that person who says, I don't really get it. I'll say, but what do you think the impact might be on this person who is upset if you don't do anything about it? You know, how would you feel if you needed something very urgently, excuse me, and they didn't get it to you on time? You'd probably be a bit annoyed. Well, in the same way, when they feel they're not being empathized with and they're not being properly cared for and looked after, and especially if you're a team leader or a manager or a leader, they're starting to think that you don't care. And that's the word for me that really matters. So I can always do it on an almost mathematical basis to make them understand it.
Now, one thing that's interesting also in today's day and age with some of the crazy things going on and all the remote working and everything else, doesn't the empathic part of it or the empathetic part of it become a little more difficult because you can maybe see them on a webcam, you can talk, you can hear maybe an emotional reaction or issue, but it's not quite the same as being there. How do you work around that problem?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. You know, I said we were chatting to a new client today, and to my absolute joy, this person said, look, you've offered all these solutions and it's absolutely fantastic. Love the program. But although you said, yeah, we can do this online, we really don't want to. What are your thoughts? Would you be happy to come up? We've got this huge room. And I said, as long as we're obeying all the national rules or, you know, regional rules that are in place, then yeah. And it's so obvious sometimes that a person's saying, look, in the room with people, you can't replace that. And we've actually been working quite hard to try and identify the phrase. And we came up with a phrase that we said identifies what that missing bit is. And in our thinking, it was the felt presence. Because in a chat like now, we're having an interactive discussion and it's on the video, you know, side of things. We're still chatting, we're still getting through to each other, we're still understanding things. But I would imagine, do tell me if I'm wrong, that three of us would rather be in the same room chatting with a cup of coffee and so on.
Right.
But oddly enough, the felt presence, as it turns out, also refers to somebody who believes there is a presence in the room, a sort of spiritual presence. So it's a psychological type term. But it was the term that we just thought, that's the bit we've got to really look at, what's missing. Now, of course, like your question, how do we replace that in an online video type call? You've still got to think, if I was in the room and we were chatting like that, what would I be doing differently that I'm now not doing? And if you can't find anything, then you're probably doing a pretty good job. And I think most of us, especially in a group chat, when we notice somebody's out of sorts, they're not quite themselves, they're very quiet, whatever it might be, I think most of us would have that and think, yeah, we need to reach out. But going back to something I mentioned on the last program about the emotional safety and security that an organization can have, when people believe they can, they have that absolute empowerment, and in fact they're encouraged to say, excuse me, what they think. That's very important, because then they will take the lead and contact their leader or manager and say, look, I just want to have a chat to you about something. Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen online where a lot of the organizations...
I think that also, certainly, you know, I managed a remote team for a very large remote team for years and years and years and years. And sometimes, certainly at the beginning, if people were out of sorts, it was actually in some ways easier to deal with it and we had video chats back then, you know. I know it's going to sound crazy. God, back in the 2000s, did we really have video chats? Yes, we did. We did. I used to have them regularly. And sometimes people feel that they can say something, they can let go a bit because they haven't got however many other people in their face, you know. they can be slightly separate, and they can then go into the chat and do a personal chat to the one person they want to talk to and say, "Ugh, I'm finding this hard." And that person or somebody looks at them, sees the stress in their face and saying, "Oh, you don't look very happy. How about, we meet up or we talk afterwards?" So I think it swings and roundabouts, if you ask me.
But also, your point's well made, but the video side of things, what I've discussed with a number of people and some of the coaches is they say, we give them the option to turn off the video camera. Because when you don't have to look at someone in the face and you don't feel you're being monitored, observed, and it's just a conversation as in audio, that in itself can be a bit easier to manage for the person who's struggling.
Yeah.
What would you say one of the biggest problems, Mac, is in the corporate world? And also to a certain point, it's a little bit different in the military world because, and you've spent many years there, the hierarchy's different. In the corporate world, it's a slightly different hierarchy, unless it's a very stoic, old-fashioned company. It's not so much top-down like it used to be. It tends to be a little more spread out. What are some of the biggest problems right now with emotional intelligence and getting teams to work? Let's say teams, because a lot of stuff right now is revolving around remote teams. How do you get rid of or not get rid of, but dim the saboteur a little bit so that they can't cause as much problem? How do you work with the people who have more emotional issues or at least aren't figuring out how they fit in the team or how to work well in a team? What would you recommend to that, or what do you see as the biggest problems in teams?
I think going back over some years now, we do a couple of things about team building. We do high-performing teams. And for me, there is a point where you get to defining that high-performing team. And it is high-performing because when somebody drops out, and I had this actually happen, last year, when the manager literally the next day didn't turn up for work. It turned out she was going to be off for about 3 weeks. When she came back, it was a bittersweet moment because she suddenly discovered that her team hadn't dropped the ball once. They'd almost operated without her and almost without needing her because they'd become so beautifully synchronized that when somebody was saying, "Wow, that's me, I've pretty much done for the day, it's only 3:00, they didn't sit back or try to look busy so they gave an easy time. They immediately reached out to the rest of the team and said, "Guys, who's struggling? Who's got too much on the plate?" And that connection is superb. So again, going back to your point, well, how do we get people to really understand all these sort of pain points? Well, you just have to make them understand that one of the key points is you have to know each other almost personally. And I think if I remember rightly, on the first chat we had, I did a little sort of experiment with you, and I said, think of that person in your life who, when the chips are down and you need to have somebody you can really talk to and trust, who is that person? More importantly, why is it that person? What are those attributes, those personality types, whatever it might be, that make that person the right one to go to and chat to? And usually the biggest word comes out is trust. Now, in an organization, the one thing for me that a team has to have is they have to have trust, and it has to be 360. Everybody has to trust everybody else. And again, sorry to go on about it, but the only way, in my belief, to do that is having that social awareness, that empathy, and understanding each other can be in very different places for very different reasons. And doing that modern approach, sitting in their chair almost, and how does that feel? And one of the things we do with new managers is we say to them, look, once you've got your feet under the table, ask someone else who would like to lead the team for a week. Obviously under your sort of guidance, so to speak. But even just watching somebody getting a bit of experience makes an interesting point from you, because you're sat back looking at them and they're looking at you, and they start understanding what it's like to be that team leader and manager. Really appreciate it.
Isn't that then also going back to your tree, where, if you look at trees in the wild, they absolutely rely on goodness coming from the ground. They absolutely rely on leaves falling. The leaves need whatever is coming through the tree to grow. The leaves then fall, and that then feeds the roots. And yes, you can take fruit off it, but some fruit actually falls, and that then feeds. So it's almost like a cyclical process. Am I right, or am I, have I missed the point?
Absolutely.
So sorry to interrupt, but we've got a message from the audience. We've got Josh Cavalier. He commented and said, during the George Floyd episode here in the States, our director of HR gathered the entire department online. She opened the floor to all of our black coworkers. They discussed their feelings, fears, hopes, and how they need to have the talk to their children about how to act around the police. It opened my eyes to their pain. Empathy is the ability to listen at the emotional level.
Absolutely spot on.
And that was a good way to deal with it too.
Leading by example.
Yeah. Now, Mac, if you look at, for example, you were in the military. There's a part of the military that's very hierarchical, and it just works that way. Everything just works that way. And then you have a little bit of a different group, which is the Special Forces group. They rely on each other in a different way, and they're smaller, tighter groups. The Special Forces management or officers involved in it are really part of the team. They're not very hierarchical. They may give an order, but the order is usually something they all understand and work together. It's more of a coordination effort. But if you look at Special Forces, the way they all have an empathy for each other. They have an empathy for what's going on. They understand what the mission is, which goes back to do your job. And they're very precise in that. But what they expect and the way they work together is different from standard military, where you tend to send people off in one direction or in a different one, and they're told to do a task, but it's from usually, in many cases nowadays, remote officers. They're not even there. Very different way of dealing with what could happen in a war situation or not, or just in normal working. With managers that in the corporate environment, with managers that are remote, we talked a little bit about this last week, those remote managers who don't get as involved with the people will probably have less empathy for them or them for that person. Would you say that's an accurate statement?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, certainly in my belief, absolutely. It's critical for that interaction to happen. And again, forgive me if I've repeated this, but I did some very informal research with a huge organization I worked with for 3 years. And I asked the guys that are coming through, who are graduate students and apprentices, who was the leader that you really aspired to be? Who was the one you wanted to go and work for? And I expected maybe a few sort of top ones up there. But what was classic was that this one person hit the top of the list by head and shoulders. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I said, look, guys, can you give me a reason for this? What is the main reason? And they said it's care. This person literally talks to us every single week. So if you're in the office, they'll come and chat to you. They know your name. They know that you might have a girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, dogs, horses in the backfield, Leslie, all that sort of thing. Right? But it was that attention to them as a person that made them absolutely outstanding. And going back to your point about the Special Forces side of things, there's a word I use to describe an absolutely perfect team, and it's cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to send a Special Forces team in to do a job, they haven't got to wonder if the guy there has got his back. You know, it's got to just happen. So in that environment, it has to be that 100% cohesion that happens. If I had a magic wand and said, you know, what can I do to an organization and its teams, I'd get them to work on EI, implement it organizational wide, and from the top down especially, to make that cohesion start to happen. But it's a tough job. It's a lot of, you know, painful things that people have to go through and start to admit and share with each other. That's the power of it, those vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
I think that it's sometimes very, very difficult for people who move up the organizational tree, you know, the higher, you know, level executives, to admit that they actually also need help and support themselves. I'm fortunate that I learned all that from my father, who always said he was only ever as good as the people who worked in his team. He said, and if the people who worked in his team weren't good, he ultimately would fail. So it was his job to make sure that he was running a good team. And believe it or not, it actually included the wives and the families of the people in the team. Because he said, if the families are not happy, the folk then going back from work when they get home, they're stressed out, they're da-da-da. What can we do to help and support them too?
Yeah, he was pretty enlightened.
That's the great thing with EI.
Yeah, he was very enlightened.
Families and
he
work. Works exactly the same.
Yeah, he was. It's probably why he ended up at the level he ended up at. But that was absolutely 100% what he believed in.
Now, Mac, kind of thinking about some of the things you're talking about, in our remote world right now, how do you hire the right people when you may not be able to even meet them in person? They're hiring people remotely like crazy right now. I can imagine, look how hard it is to hire people when you meet them in person. So remotely, you've got less going for you. What would you recommend as far as a remote hire? How do you get? Do you have more than maybe a group interview? Do you have different people? You get more feelings out of that person. What would make a good remote interview?
I don't think, as it may be a controversial thing to say, but I often say that we look at this thing as this big, huge shift going from face-to-face to remote, online interviews, all the thing. If your interview process was working particularly successfully before, theoretically, there should be no reason why it's going to not work as effectively online. I understand, like we talked about earlier, that felt presence won't be there. But I remember reading something from a chap, Henry Stewart, and Henry works at a company called Happy in London.
Yeah.
And he wrote, and he said, look, you don't have to really interview for skills. If you're looking for an accountant and they've got the qualifications, certifications, etc., and they've got a reference, then you're pretty much quids in. And he said, interview for the person. They're going to be working for you. What are your values? What are your underpinning behaviors in the organization? What do you want this person to be like? Now, that can be done in a couple of ways. Obviously, chatting, but also what I talked to a guy on Monday and I said, why haven't you got them doing filling in a form and making a statement? What's important to me? What drives me? What is my moral compass? And when you write about those things, you have time to put it down yourself and think about it and send it in. Could people write about how wonderful they are and not actually be that wonderful? Clearly. But those are where the questions come in, and very good questions will uncover certain things that people are trying to promote which aren't necessarily accurate.
Yeah, good to know. That's good. Well, we are about close to the end of our time. Any other questions in the chat?
None.
And by the way, Josh Cavalier, who was in the chat room, I didn't know he was in there, but he will be on the show in 2 weeks. So we'll see him then. And next week we've got Ajay Pangarkar coming on, which I know Leslie knows very well. So Mac, as always,
that's going to be interesting because Ajay's wife, Teresa, and I are distantly related. I know, it sounds bizarre, doesn't it?
I think all Scots are related, aren't isn't that?
Us Scots get about, don't we, Mac?
Indeed.
You mean Mac and I say I'm originally a MacDonald, so for all I know, Mac and I might actually be related.
There may be somewhere down the road.
A long way in the past.
Yeah.
Eh?
Mac, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the last couple of weeks and before that. You're always a source of great information, and congratulations on the new client, by the way. So that's always a good thing to have, and we appreciate your sharing with us, and good stuff ahead. I am sure. Anytime you want to come on, let us know, and you're more than welcome. And for all you folks watching, whether in the chat room or watching the show later on, please subscribe or leave feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And the people on the show usually also check with LinkedIn, or they'll be on YouTube or something. So leave feedback for them. They can probably answer questions, or if nothing else, send out a hi, how are you? So again, Mac, appreciate having you on again. Leslie, as always. And we will see you all next week on eLearnChat. Have a good one, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.